In 1933, Agent William Morrison walked into the federal building in Chicago, carrying two badges in his coat pocket. One was brass, issued by the Bureau of Investigation, authorizing him to uphold the law of the United States. The other was made of gold, given to him by Al Capone, buying his silence and his service. For 18 months, Agent Morrison had lived a double life that would have destroyed lesser men. By day, he filed reports on organized crime activities. By night, he warned those same criminals about impending raids. He was paid by the federal government to catch Al Capone, and paid far more by Al Capone to make sure he never would be caught. This is the story of how one man's greed corrupted both sides of the law. How Al Capone discovered that the right price could buy almost anyone, including the agents sworn to bring him down. And how the most dangerous game in Chicago wasn't being played in back alleys or speakeasies, but in the offices of the federal building itself. It's a story about the thin line between law and lawlessness, and what happens when that line disappears entirely. William Morrison was exactly the kind of man the Bureau of Investigation wanted in 1931. 34 years old, college-educated, from a good family in Ohio. He'd served in the Great War, worked as a bank examiner, and possessed the serious demeanor that J. Edgar Hoover demanded from his agents. Morrison was assigned to the Chicago office specifically because of his clean record. The Bureau needed men who couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be corrupted. Chicago had already claimed too many good agents, either through bribery or bullets. Morrison seemed like someone who could resist both. His job was simple in concept, impossible in execution: gather intelligence on Al Capone's organization. The government had finally decided to use federal tax laws to bring down the man local law enforcement couldn't touch. But they needed inside information: names, dates, financial records, anything that could prove Capone had income he hadn't reported to the Internal Revenue Service. Agent Morrison rented a small apartment on the north side and began his work methodically. He interviewed witnesses, followed suspects, documented transactions. He was thorough, professional, and completely invisible to Capone's organization. For 6 months, Morrison built cases the way he'd been trained to build them: carefully, legally, by the book. He filed detailed reports with his superiors. He followed every lead. He worked 16-hour days, driven by the belief that he was serving justice. But Agent Morrison had one weakness that he didn't fully understand until it was too late. He had expensive tastes and a government salary. Morrison's problems started small, the way financial problems always do. His wife Eleanor had suffered a difficult pregnancy with their second child. The medical bills were substantial, more than Morrison's government salary could easily cover. He'd borrowed money from his father, then from the bank, then from friends. By early 1932, Agent Morrison owed nearly $2,000 to various creditors. On a federal salary of $1,800 a year, that debt might as well have been $2 million. Eleanor was still weak from childbirth complications. The baby required special medical care. The bills kept coming, and Morrison's salary couldn't keep pace. He tried to handle it quietly, the way respectable men handled financial difficulties. He worked extra hours hoping for overtime pay that never materialized. He applied for a transfer to a position with higher salary, but was told he was too valuable in his current assignment. He even considered quitting the bureau and returning to banking, but Eleanor's medical needs required the health insurance his government job provided. Agent Morrison was trapped, and he knew it. What he didn't know was that Al Capone's organization made it their business to identify exactly these kinds of traps. The approach came in March of 1932, and it was so subtle that Morrison almost missed it entirely. He was having lunch at a small restaurant near the federal building when a well-dressed man approached his table. The man was in his 40s, carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Agent Morrison, I'm Frank Nitti. I believe we have a mutual friend." Morrison recognized the name immediately. Frank Nitti was Capone's top lieutenant, the man who handled the organization's business affairs. He was also wanted for questioning in connection with several federal cases. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, but Nitti smiled and raised both hands peacefully. "Relax, Agent Morrison. This isn't that kind of conversation. I'm here about your wife." "My wife? She's been seeing Dr. Patterson about her condition, hasn't she?" "Excellent doctor. Very expensive. I imagine the bills have been challenging on a government salary." Morrison felt his blood pressure rising. "If you're threatening my family..." "Threatening?" Nitti looked genuinely shocked. "Agent Morrison, you've misunderstood me completely. I'm here to help." Nitti placed a business card on the table. "I represent certain businessmen who appreciate the valuable work you do for the community. They'd like to express their gratitude." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't," Nitti said with a knowing smile. "You're an honest federal agent doing honest work. But honest work doesn't always pay honest bills, does it? That evening, Morrison found an envelope under his apartment door. Inside was $500 in cash and a note for Mrs. Morrison's continued good health, no strings attached. A grateful citizen, Morrison stared at the money for 2 hours. $500 would pay Eleanor's medical bills and give them breathing room for the first time in months, but he knew exactly where it had come from, and he knew what accepting it would mean. He told himself he'd return it. He told himself he'd report it to his supervisors. He told himself that taking money from criminals was exactly the kind of corruption he'd sworn to fight against. But when Eleanor woke up coughing in the middle of the night, the same cough that had been getting worse for weeks, Morrison made a different decision. He used the money to pay her medical bills. The next morning, he received a phone call at his office. "Agent Morrison, this is Frank Nitti. I hope your wife is feeling better." "Mr. Nitti, about that money." "What money?" "I have no idea what you're talking about, but I was wondering if you might be free for lunch today. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." The lunch meeting took place at the Palmer House Hotel, in a private dining room, where no one could overhear their conversation. Nitti had ordered for both of them expensive steaks, fine wine, the kind of meal that cost more than Morrison made in a week. "Let me be clear about something," Nitti said as they ate. "We don't want you to do anything illegal. We're not asking you to falsify evidence or sabotage investigations." Morrison waited, knowing there would be more. "We simply want to know what the Bureau is planning, when raids are scheduled, which witnesses are being interviewed, information that would be professionally valuable to our business associates." "That's still illegal, is it? You're not breaking any laws. You're not planting evidence or destroying files. You're simply sharing information that helps businessmen protect their legitimate interests." Nitti leaned forward. "Agent Morrison, let me ask you something. How long have you been investigating Mr. Capone?" 8 months. "And how many indictments have resulted from your work?" Morrison didn't answer. "I'll tell you how many. 0. You've spent 8 months chasing shadows while your wife gets sicker and your debts get larger. What if I told you there was a way to serve justice while also serving your family's needs?" "What do you mean?" "The Bureau wants Al Capone." "Fair enough, but they want him for tax evasion, paperwork crimes, not real crimes. What if you could help them get their conviction while ensuring that the investigation doesn't harm innocent people? What if you could guide the case toward a resolution that serves everyone's interests?" For the next 18 months, Agent Morrison lived 2 lives with increasing skill and decreasing conscience. His reports to the Bureau were models of thoroughness and professionalism. He documented Capone's activities, identified potential witnesses, mapped the organization's structure. His superiors praised his work and used his intelligence to plan their strategy. But every piece of information Morrison gathered was also passed to Frank Nitti within hours of being filed. When the Bureau planned to raid a warehouse, Nitti knew the timing and location. When agents were scheduled to interview potential witnesses, those witnesses were coached on what to say, or convinced to disappear entirely. Morrison told himself he was playing both sides, maintaining his integrity while protecting his family. The truth was simpler and more damning. He was selling his badge to the highest bidder. The money came regularly now, never directly from Capone, always through intermediaries. $1,000 here, $500 there, always with plausible explanations. Payment for consulting work or security advice or research services. Morrison even filed tax returns on the income, listing it as miscellaneous earnings from private security work. Eleanor's health improved dramatically with proper medical care. Morrison paid off his debts and moved his family to a better apartment. He bought Eleanor the pearl necklace she'd admired in a shop window. He opened college savings accounts for their children. By all external measures, Agent Morrison was succeeding at everything he'd set out to achieve. His bureau career was advancing. His family was secure. His financial worries were over. But success built on corruption has a way of demanding more corruption to sustain itself. Al Capone had not survived in Chicago by trusting people completely. Even as he paid Agent Morrison for information, he had other sources watching Morrison, testing the intelligence he provided, looking for signs of betrayal. In late 1932, Capone began to suspect that Morrison might be playing both sides more cleverly than anyone realized. "The information is too good," Capone told Nitti during one of their private conversations. "This Morrison character is giving us everything we want to hear. Every raid he warns us about gets canceled or delayed. Every witness he identifies suddenly develops memory problems. It's like he's orchestrating the whole investigation." "Maybe he is," Nitti said. "Maybe that's exactly what he's doing." Capone studied his lieutenant's face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe Agent Morrison isn't just selling us information. Maybe he's selling the Bureau a story." Maybe he's feeding both sides exactly what they want to hear, while making sure neither side gets what they really want. Capone was quiet for a long moment. You think he's playing us? I think he's playing everyone, including himself. To test Morrison's loyalty, Capone devised a trap that would force the agent to choose sides definitively. Through Nitti, Capone fed Morrison false information about a planned meeting with a rival gang leader. The meeting was supposed to take place at a warehouse on the south side, and Morrison was told that Capone would be there personally to negotiate a territory dispute. If Morrison was truly loyal to Capone, he would warn them that the Bureau was planning to raid the meeting. If he was truly loyal to the Bureau, he would report the meeting and let them attempt to arrest Capone there. But if Morrison was playing both sides, he would find a way to ensure that neither side got what they wanted. Morrison received the information on a Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday morning, he had to decide what to do with it. He could report the meeting to his Bureau superiors and potentially capture the biggest prize in American law enforcement. He could warn Capone about a potential Bureau raid and maintain his profitable relationship with the organization. Or he could find a third option that served his own interests above everyone else's. Morrison chose the third option. He reported the meeting to the Bureau, but claimed his source was unreliable and the information might be false. He suggested that rather than mounting a full raid, they should conduct limited surveillance to verify the intelligence before committing resources. At the same time, he warned Nitti that the Bureau had received unconfirmed reports of a possible meeting, but that he'd convinced his superiors to delay any action until the information could be verified. Morrison's plan was elegant. The Bureau would send a small surveillance team that would observe an empty warehouse, confirming Morrison's assessment that the intelligence was unreliable. Capone would see that Morrison had successfully neutralized a potential threat. Both sides would trust Morrison more completely than before. But Al Capone was not the kind of man who left his survival to chance. On the day of the supposed meeting, both sides discovered Morrison's deception simultaneously. The Bureau surveillance team arrived at the warehouse to find federal agents already in position, agents who had been tipped off through a different channel about Morrison's activities. Morrison's immediate supervisor, Agent Patrick Collins, had been conducting his own investigation into the suspicious failure of recent Bureau operations. At the same time, Capone's men arrived to find the warehouse surrounded by federal agents, proving that Morrison's warning had been either incomplete or deliberately misleading. Both sides realized they'd been played. Agent Collins arrested Morrison that afternoon as he returned to the federal building. The charges were conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accepting bribes from a federal fugitive. Frank Nitti visited Morrison that evening in his federal holding cell. "You got greedy," Nitti said simply. "You thought you could play Al Capone the same way you played the Bureau. That was your mistake." Morrison, still wearing his federal badge because the paperwork for his suspension hadn't been processed yet, looked up at his former handler. "What's going to happen to me?" "That depends. How much does the Bureau know about our arrangement?" "Nothing. I never kept records. All our meetings were verbal." Nitti nodded approvingly. "Smart. Al respects that kind of professionalism, even when it's being used against him. So what happens now? Now you serve your time quietly. You keep your mouth shut about anything that might embarrass Mr. Capone, and when you get out you disappear from Chicago forever. And if I don't?" Nitti's smile was colder than Morrison had ever seen it. "Then your family might have some of the same health problems that brought you to our attention in the first place." Agent Morrison was convicted of corruption and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. He served 3 years before being released for good behavior. His wife Eleanor divorced him while he was incarcerated and moved back to Ohio with their children. Morrison never worked in law enforcement again. He spent the rest of his life as a traveling salesman, moving from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough for his past to catch up with him. He died in 1967, alone in a motel room in Kansas, carrying the weight of his choices for 34 years. The Morrison case led to major reforms in the Bureau of Investigation, including enhanced background checks, regular financial audits of agents, and improved internal surveillance procedures. J. Edgar Hoover used the scandal to argue for expanded powers to investigate his own agents, powers that would later be used for far more questionable purposes. Al Capone learned different lessons from the experience. He became more cautious about bribing federal agents, but he also became more sophisticated about it. Instead of direct payments, the organization began offering legitimate business opportunities to agents' family members, harder to trace benefits that served the same purpose without leaving the same evidence trail. Years later, during his final years in Florida, Al Capone would sometimes think about Agent Morrison, not with anger or resentment, but with something approaching understanding. Morrison wasn't a bad man, Capone told Frank Nitti during one of their rare conversations after Capone's release from prison. He was just a man who got caught between what he believed and what he needed. He betrayed you, Al. He betrayed the Bureau. He betrayed everyone. No, Capone said quietly. He betrayed himself. The rest of us, we were just business. But Morrison, he had to live with knowing he sold everything he believed in for money he spent on medical bills. Capone was silent for a moment, staring out at the Florida ocean. You know what the real tragedy was? He was a good agent. If he'd stayed honest, he probably would have caught me eventually. His reports were thorough. His investigations were smart. He understood how we worked better than most federal agents ever did. So why did he take the money? Because he was human, and humans break when you press them in the right places. Morrison's weak spot was his family. Someone else's might be their pride, or their fear, or their ambition. But everyone has a weak spot. You just have to be patient enough to find it. The story of Agent Morrison and Al Capone isn't really about crime and punishment. It's about the price of compromise and the weight of choices that seem reasonable at the time but become unbearable in retrospect. Morrison started with a single payment to cover his wife's medical bills. That one decision led to 18 months of deception, a federal conviction, the destruction of his family, and a lifetime of regret. Each step seemed logical, even necessary, but the path led inexorably toward moral bankruptcy. Al Capone understood that most people aren't brought low by dramatic temptations, but by small compromises that accumulate over time. He knew that the most dangerous corruption wasn't the kind that announced itself with violence and threats, but the kind that whispered quietly about practical necessities and family obligations. The federal government learned that badges and oaths aren't enough to guarantee integrity, that good men can make bad choices when they're pressed hard enough in the right places, that the law is only as strong as the people sworn to uphold it, and those people are only human. In the end, everyone involved paid a price for their choices. Morrison lost his family, his career, and his self-respect. The Bureau lost public confidence and had to implement costly new oversight procedures. Al Capone learned that even his money couldn't buy absolute loyalty, only temporary advantage. The real lesson of Agent Morrison's fall isn't about good versus evil, but about the complicated space where most of us live, the place where good people make questionable choices for understandable reasons, and where the line between right and wrong isn't always as clear as we'd like it to be. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one pointing a gun at you. Sometimes it's the one offering to solve your problems with money you desperately need, and telling you that what they're asking isn't really so wrong after all. Agent Morrison learned that lesson the hard way. Al Capone taught it with the patience of a man who understood that everyone's integrity has a price. You just have to be willing to pay it.